Hello, good evening, everybody. I'm very glad to be back here at the Delphi Forum. A pleasure to have Robert Kagan with us. Thank you, Bob. Thank you for being here.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
First of all, let's get the facts straight. You were born in Athens, right?
I was born in Athens, yes.
And how long did you stay there? Here?
I stayed a full 6 months.
And you had real difficulty getting out of the country at the age of 6 months.
At the age of 6 months, I think the Greek government's position at the time was that my parents hadn't brought me in, so they don't understand what they were taking out. So,
okay, well, hopefully
we worked it out.
Yeah, hopefully you will not be drafted in the military or something like this. Yes,
let's hope not.
Okay, the first thing I want to ask you is, you've written this famous book arguing that the jungle is growing back, that basically this whole post-world liberal system is being threatened. Are you really worried about that now, the way things are going in Ukraine with the rise of China and so on?
Well, let me be clear about what I mean by it. The jungle is always growing back, in the sense that the point I was trying to make was that we've lived in a very special period in the history of the human race where democracy and individual rights are respected. We've had tremendous economic wealth compiled over the course of the 20th century and into now. And basically, the world has been at peace in terms of great power conflict. But it's good to remember that that's a rare circumstance in history. In fact, it's an unusual circumstance. And I think the point is it's not a natural circumstance. In order to have that world, you have to be actively creating that world. In the same way, if a garden is not natural. You have to tend to a garden. You have to not let nature take control. And so the jungle is always pressuring this world because human beings are divided in their impulses. I mean, yes, people like to be free, but people like other things too, and sometimes they like other things more than they care about being free. So these pressures are always there. In answer to your question, I think the jungle is going back, but we're not necessarily going to be overrun by it. And I think that the basic structure of the international system that we've been living in for the past several decades is still intact. A lot will depend on what happens in Ukraine. A lot will depend on what choices are made in East Asia. But right now, I think we have it within our capacity to hold on to this garden that we've created, but it requires real work and real solidarity, and unfortunately it requires fighting, because this world was created by war, and it'll be changed by war.
So you think war is inevitable with China, for example?
I don't think it's inevitable. I mean, inevitable is a strong word. Obviously, there's going to be continuing pressure and tension depending on what course China decides to take. I suppose you could say depending on what course the United States decides to take as well. So I think, it's something to be very cognizant of, but I don't think it's inevitable. I think that China can be successfully deterred if the people who need to deter it are determined to do so. And I also think China can be encouraged to move in the direction of increasing its wealth, increasing the well-being of its people, and perhaps discouraged from a kind of atavistic desire for territory, even territory that they think is theirs.
Now, you talked about before about this momentary unipolar world that lasted a couple of decades, at the most. Do you think the West showed some arrogance? Was there some hubris there? The way it dealt with Iraq, for example, after 9/11, the way it treated the defeated of the Cold War, and so on.
Those are a lot of different things.
Yes.
Obviously, I'll speak up for the United States, not for the West, but for the United States. I'm a historian of American foreign policy. Mistakes are what we do. The United States is not a perfect country, although as I look around the world at other countries and their histories, I don't think they're perfect either. So the United States has made mistakes, fallen into traps. It is worth recalling, however, that the reason it falls into traps like Iraq, like Vietnam, is because Americans do have, or at least have had, a sense of global responsibility. That can lead to bad decisions and can lead to good decisions, but it's the same sense of global responsibility that has also kept the United States defending allies and sending troops, just deploying troops in a way that no other country has ever done in history. So, you have to take both sides of it. In terms of the way the Cold War ended, I don't blame the West for the way the Cold War ended. Of course, some Russians are unhappy, in the same way that some Germans were unhappy after World War I. It doesn't mean that's what losing does to you. And I think what we're dealing with here, what we're looking at now, is a Russia that is trying to claw back a kind of traditional hegemony that it has enjoyed in Eastern and Central Europe. But if you really look at it, it doesn't really have the power, at least at the moment, to be able to accomplish that. And so it's trying to accomplish it basically by hoping for, and if possible, sowing division in the West, which allows its relatively weak position to be successful in Ukraine, and then, who knows what comes after that.
Now, when we look at Ukraine, it's really hard to see how Ukraine can win this war. I mean, I'm looking at the stories this week, they're running out of electricity. US aid is held up on the hill, as you know, and all this. Can you see a positive end game from Zelensky's point of view?
The only thing I will say, and I don't need to tell this audience this, is that wars are hard to predict, and also the politics of wars are hard to predict. And so I feel like we have definitely put ourselves in a position where Ukraine now, as you say, does not have what it needs even to put up the fight that it needs to hold on to what it already has. And that's a failing on our part. That's a failing on America's part. I would say primarily America, but certainly to some extent, everybody who's been trying to help Ukraine has failed in that regard. But should Ukraine hold on, Russia has turned itself, or Putin has turned Russia into a military state, basically. And you can do that for a while, but I wonder how long that's sustainable. And so it's very unfortunate because I feel like, there were real questions about the sustainability of it in the first year, but because, for a variety of reasons, but certainly one, because we were slow in getting the kind of weaponry that Ukraine needed, we gave Russia a chance to sort of get back in the game, which is where they are right now. But I don't think it's a foregone conclusion.
But what kind of end game?
What does win mean? I'm not going to get into, do they have to agree to lose the Donbass? That is not where Ukraine is right now. I don't think that's where Ukraine should be right now. We could talk about end games, but how about we just do what needs to be done right now? I would like to start with that. If you look at any war and you look at the down moment of your side in that war, you could say, well, it's finished. For instance, the beginning of World War II didn't look very promising at first. So I don't want to think that way. What I want to think about is let's do what needs to be done and give Ukraine a chance to hold on. Because at a certain point, Russia also has to take into account the cost that it's bearing, that the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives that are being affected by it. I don't know that they can go on indefinitely. And so it's a tragedy that we haven't given Moscow and Putin a sense that we are in this for as long as it takes. Instead, we're creating doubt.
You think this deadlock on the Hill will last until November?
I don't know. I honestly don't know, and I think a lot of people don't know. If I had to bet, I would say they're not going to pass Ukraine aid, if I actually had to bet. And it pains me to say that, and it's tragic, but you've got by the way, if you held a vote in the United States, if you held a vote in Congress, if you held a vote in the House, it would pass with a majority. What you have is a minority of Republicans who have, with Donald Trump behind them, have basically stymied the operation. Mike Johnson says he wants to do it, but I don't know whether he has to choose between helping Ukraine and losing his job. And unfortunately, selfish ambition has been a major factor in American politics.
Now, the question is, we'll go later on into who is going to win this election, but if Trump wins, you think that's going to make a huge difference in terms of policy towards Russia and Ukraine?
I think it will. He's pretty clear about what he wants. He's laid out his secret peace plan, which is no secret. It's Ukraine gives away everything that Russia wants them to give. I don't know whether he realizes that with Russia, with Putin, any agreement is only a pause. It's not the end of the story. It's where Putin consolidates before he makes his next move. I think that's very clear. Whether Trump understands that, I don't know. The thing about Trump is, and I'm sure you can see this from where you are, he doesn't have any beliefs. There's nothing that he's absolutely committed to. Everything is transactional for him. Everything is about particularly money for him. If I were advising governments on how to deal with Trump if he's elected, I would say give him lots of money. You know, give him, by the way, personally, not to America, give him personally or his family lots of money, and you'll have an influence on his foreign policy decisions. But what he lacks, and this I think is important because I think people don't understand it, it isn't so much what he wants to do or doesn't want to do. He lacks what every president until him has had since the World War II, which is a sense of America's role in the system, a sense of responsibility, a sense of closeness to allies. Trump has no closeness to anyone in his personal life and certainly not in his diplomatic life. So it's more what I think could happen because the United States is simply not doing anything. I don't know what would provoke Trump to take action. And that's the big difference, you know. Not supporting Ukraine now, you can only not support Ukraine now if your basic view is the United States doesn't have to worry about Europe at all. Because if the United States has to worry about Europe at all, then the place they ought to be worrying about it right now is Ukraine, so that they're not worrying about it in the Baltics and they're not worrying about it in Poland and Central Europe. Or in other places that are going to be vulnerable. But if you don't care about Europe at all, which, by the way, you may remember, Americans have had that view in the past, and Trump is resurrected, and so do many of the people who support him, then there's nothing to get. It doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter what aggression Putin commits. You could still say we don't care.
Now, I mean, I've heard two theories. One is that this time Trump is going to be unhinged, and he'll have the Michael Flynn's of the world around him. There's the other theory that, you know, good old establishment figures like Mike Pompeo will, you know, come back and the rest, and that he'll have more of a predictable foreign policy. Which one would you buy?
I'm definitely believe the first. You know, he knows very well, and certainly the people who are going to be staffing his government know perfectly well, that Trump was stymied as president by the fact, by the way, Mike Pompeo was not such a great figure as far as I'm concerned.
Given the circumstance, I think.
If you like. But there were people in the government who were actively trying to stop him from doing this and that and the other thing, various chiefs of staff, various national security. They will not be there this time. I'm confident about that. Trump is not going to have people who say no to him or say, well, let me get back to you on that, Mr. President. He's going to have people in there who are not only going to do what he says, they're going to do what he says before he says it. They're going to know what needs to be done. They're going to have their own axes to grind. And those are the people, the Michael Flynns of this world, whether it's Michael Flynn himself or people of that ilk, they are going to populate, you know, a second Trump term. And I don't think there's any question about that. People say the other thing about, oh, thank goodness we'll have Mike Pompeo. Because they want to justify their support for Trump, and they want to make it seem as unthreatening as possible. But it will be threatening.
What happened to the old enlightened Republican Party of, you know, even Dick Cheney looks very enlightened to me. You know,
I was about to say, when was I going to be in Europe and hear about the enlightened Republican Party?
It's true. You miss people like Peter Luger and all those people.
Well, that's an old Republican Party. Where did it go?
Are they scared, basically? Are they?
They've headed for the hills. I mean, the Trump movement has become so dominant and so aggressive in the party that people are afraid to cross them. And I see that in among thinkers and think tanks and intellectuals, even they fall into line and they come up with excuses for why it's all going to be okay. There are, it's interesting to see right now, there is a little bit of a mini rebellion going on in the House of Representatives on the Ukraine and Russia issue. Some of the very influential Republicans are talking about the fact that Russian disinformation is coming out of the mouths of Republican congressmen these days. That's quite a little fight in that crowd, and I'm curious to see how that turns out. So there is a little bit, and it is true, and this is the one thing that is encouraging. I'm pretty sure a majority of Republicans have a positive view of Ronald Reagan. That's why people, by the way, are now writing articles about how Trump and Reagan are actually very similar, which is nonsense. But the reason they're saying that is because the Reaganites want to feel better about supporting Trump. I think if Trump were to disappear tomorrow, you would still have a strong, basically, Reaganite. Now, you may like Reaganite or you may not like Reaganite. I've been through this with Europe now for decades, so I don't want to, make it sound like it's wonderful to be Reaganite if you don't feel that way. But that party is still there, but it is now being actively oppressed and frightened.
Now, talk a bit about Trump as a phenomenon, because I think even if Trump is defeated, this is going to go on for a while. How much does white anxiety have to do with the Trump phenomenon?
It has everything to do with the Trump phenomenon. I think that Trump has tapped, it wasn't so hard to tap into, everybody knows it's there. It's been there throughout American history, by the way. There have been, white status anxiety has been a major feature of American politics from the very beginning, even during the period of slavery, and now I think it's back. But Trump has both benefited from it, but he's also spurred it. He's also made it acceptable. He's made it legitimate. I mean, let's not forget that he ran his first campaign in 2012 as a white supremacist. He ran on the Obama birther conspiracy, which is to say the first American black president is not really an American. And everybody knew what that meant, and all the people who have this white status anxiety immediately glommed onto him. And now, the degree to which he has made himself, which is just, the world is too crazy. He's the avatar of Christian nationalism in America. The evangelicals are completely in with him, even when he even when he's wrong on abortion from their point of view. And so he's got this force. He could not exist without that force. But he also has strengthened it, energized it, brought it out in a way that it has not been since the 1920s.
You think the woke culture had something to do with, did it work as a multiplier, amplifier for his?
It's always woke culture in America. This is people treat woke as if this is something new in American politics. But the same white anxiety existed when, after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 and desegregation, the same white anxiety existed in the post-Civil War period. This is an ongoing phenomenon. And wokeism, I don't like the word, it has all kinds of connotations, but there was a time, for instance, in the late 19th century when Irish Americans were depicted in national cartoons as ape-like creatures with a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a club in the other. There was a time when Italian Americans were treated like dirt. And all of these groups used the American system first to demand their rights and then to demand respect. And a lot of what woke is about is asking for respect. Now, can it go too far? Yes. Can it turn into tried language control? Is cancel culture ridiculous? Yes, but I think those things are also self-correcting. And I wouldn't get all worked up about the fact that, American blacks want to be treated not only equally under the law, but they want to be treated equally in society. And they don't want people to say things about them just the way Jewish Americans don't, and Irish Americans don't, and Italian Americans don't. And the woke It's not the wokeness, it's the people responding to it. And again, it's the same old response. It's the same white status anxiety. What they're really upset about is that, as they would put it, it doesn't look like their country anymore.
So you don't think the woke culture undermines meritocracy or undermines the freedom of expression within an academic environment, for example?
You're weighing a lot of yes, and that's a bad thing when that happens. And by the way, there's a lot of, it's not just what I would call liberalism versus anti-liberalism. There's also an anti-liberalism on the left, and I think that is there's a very strong anti-liberal strain on the left, and that is very much in the academy, and things are out of control. But look what's happened. There's been a lot of reining back of this, of the DEI, the diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff. People are trying to be a little bit more reasonable. But, I don't accept the argument, the left made me do it. The left made me support a fascist dictator. By the way, that does happen in countries, right? I mean, a lot of Germans supported
the Weimar thing was, yeah.
because the others. By the way, that wasn't just liberals in the academy; those were communists in the streets. So, but it's a common phenomenon where you say those people are crazy, and therefore I am supporting this person.
There's been a lot of self-criticism in media and so on about the failure of the elite in the U.S. to listen to the average person and to even to look down at them. You buy that?
No. For one thing, a lot of this fight is elite versus elite. The intellectuals who are at the spearhead of the Trump movement, they're also elites. By the way, Trump is allegedly a billionaire. In what way is he not an elite? In what way is Josh Hawley not an elite? And it's always been the case. And so but it's typically the case that one elite claims to speak for the common man, so to speak. But the division in this country in America is not between elites and non-elites. The division is between white Christians, and people that they feel are, in their view, not American.
Now, who's going to win?
Who's going to win? I don't
Simple
know.
question. Your gut feeling?
If you put a gun to my head, I would say I think Biden is going to win. But I don't have anything like confidence enough. I cannot relax because I think the odds of a Trump victory are high enough that because I think it's an apocalyptic event if Trump is elected.
Can you see any unforeseen kind of development, like the Democrats changing candidate or something like this?
That's not an unforeseen development. That's a development that was hoped for and has not happened.
Well,
it's not going to happen.
It's the Washington chit-chat, as you know.
I mean, unless it's a health issue, I can't see. It's too late to change. And by the way, I'm among those who think, are we so sure that there's a person out there that the entire Democratic Party is just going to rally around like that? Who is that person? I hear names, people give this name, that name, and then the minute that person is nominated, you're going to find all kinds of things that people don't like about it. The candidate that doesn't exist is always the most attractive candidate.
True. Now, the question is, if Trump wins, do you see any potential for civil strife? And if Biden wins by a very small majority, do you see the potential for civil war or something like this? There's a lot of talk about this.
I think if Biden wins by any margin, even if he wins by 3 or 4 points, I think that Trump is going to declare that he's made it very clear. By the way, he's declared every election that he's run in fraudulent, including the one he won in 2016. Because the popular vote, he claims, was rigged against him. So he's going to claim that the vote is rigged. And then the question is, what does the Republican Party do? I believe he is sufficiently in control of the Republican Party now that the Republican Party, as a party, will support his claim that he was robbed of the election. And then you move into it, which is not what happened in 2020, obviously. The Republican Party kind of, didn't really stick by him. This time they will. And so what happens if that happens? And I can spin all kinds of scenarios. One scenario that I think people don't think enough about, although it's very common in the earlier period of American history, is secession, is state secession. or at least state nullification in the sense that...
So exactly, walk us down that path. What do you mean by that?
Let's walk down that path, yes. Let's say, pick your overwhelmingly Republican state, Alabama, Wyoming, what have you, Texas. In fact, Texas is a good bet. So, because Texas is already engaging in a degree of nullification. Texas is passing its own immigration and border laws, which is not constitutional. I think it's not inconceivable that the governor and the legislatures in overwhelmingly Republican states say they do not accept the legitimacy of the federal government, of the current administration. Now, what does that mean? You know, in theory, the federal government then would say, okay, then we're cutting you off, you get no money, you know, you're out, or what have you. I don't know that Biden would do that, because that's a pretty big step. So I think we would be in a very strange, and I can even imagine a confederation, if you will, of Republican states that are not accepting. And then I can't walk down all the where that goes, but I think that's
has the U.S. been there before?
Oh, sure. In the 19th century, repeatedly, there were either threats of secession or actual attempts at secession. By the way, almost all of them were only defeated by one thing, which was the force or the threat of force. You know, Andrew Jackson threatened to send force into South Carolina when it engaged in nullification. You know, the South was effectively engaging in nullification after Brown versus Board of Education, and Eisenhower sent troops into Little Rock, Arkansas, the 82nd Airborne. And so I don't know if that's where, but it was very frequent, and it's good. Americans need to remember, as we are learning now, the 19th century is not irrelevant to American history, and we still have the same federal system that we had in the 19th century. It hasn't changed, and so these options are still there. And by the way, if you poll Americans on the idea of secession, you get a strikingly high number of people who accept it, Republicans and Democrats, because one of your original question was, what happens if Trump wins? And I think depending on how Trump behaves, I could see Democratic states also saying, wait a minute, he is behaving extra constitutionally, so what constitution are we in? I think that, you know, California, New York, other states like that, it'll be interesting to see if Trump does in fact become authoritarian in his policies.
You seem to think that the U.S. will go through another January 6th.
Oh, I mean, I don't know about an attack on the Capitol per se.
Not exactly the
but
same thing.
As you all know, the United States is a heavily armed country, and political violence has been on the increase, and there are people out there raring to go. The people who did attack January 6th, especially those who were ex-military, they said, we're fighting again for our country. And so, because one side, in this case, you know, the Trump movement has co-opted patriotism, they will feel, that's, you know, a lot of these militia groups see themselves in a tradition going back to the revolution. And so I think that, I don't think anybody doubts that there'll be violence. The question is it violence with an effect? Is it violence with that has a consequence? What does it lead to? And I think we just don't know the answer to that.
Now, the framers had not thought of a possibility of a convicted president, I guess. What happens if Trump is convicted before the election or right after?
I mean, he can, if he's convicted after he's not going to be convicted after the election. He'll pardon, you know, he's not going to be convicted after the election. That's why the Supreme Court is punting. The Supreme Court doesn't want to have to make a decision. They're hoping that it'll be taken care of for them. Either he loses or he wins, in which case that's the end of that. So if he's convicted of there's probably only one trial that he can be convicted of at this stage, probably, but he can still serve as president. He's not prevented from serving as president if he's convicted. He could serve from jail, I suppose.
That would be
probably not. Probably not.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think that unfortunately the legal system. And by the way, it was wrong. I mean, I don't blame people for doing it, but this problem was not supposed to be addressed in the court. In fact, I love being here in Greece now because the Greeks had a method for dealing with people who were presumed to be threats to Athenian democracy, which was ostracism. Yeah. I think they wrote it on a little shard of pottery or something. Just write down a name. And if they got a lot of votes, then they were out. Alcibiades, was he ostracized or did he just get thrown out? Anyway, enough, you guys, I shouldn't talk about Greece here. But in America, they have the impeachment process, which is similar in a way, because it's not a question of law. It's a question of identifying the Caesar in your midst. And you don't serve a subpoena to Caesar and tell him to lawyer up. You know, we had a method for dealing with a person like Trump, and the Republican senators, and particularly those like Mitch McConnell and other sort of respectable establishment Republicans, they had a chance to prevent Donald Trump from being able to run again, and they failed because they were cowardly.
Now, when I look at the world and public opinion and so on, there's a lot of skepticism towards the US and towards the West. And the global South and so on looks at the West with suspicion. Is this a new thing? Is this justified? How can the US address that?
I mean, obviously, it's not a new thing. I've been kind of amused at people treating this like I said. What was the non-aligned movement during the Cold War? I mean, I think that the idea that there are vast portions of the world that are not directly engaged in this sort of whatever you want to call it, Cold War, great power conflict, and have needs and interests that have nothing to do with that. And yes, it's true. They don't necessarily need to come down on one side or the other, and they do feel, obviously, that they're not treated well in this system. And I think that's just always been true. Nobody here is under any illusion that the United States during the Cold War was incredibly popular in the global South. It definitely was not. And so, in fact, I would say the United States' relationship with the global South today is better than it was when Nixon was having things thrown at him in Venezuela, or wherever he was having things thrown at him in Latin America, which is probably a lot of different places. I mean, so I don't consider it's an issue. I don't expect every country to line up with the United States and Europe. That's not their interest. On the other hand, I also feel like every country in the world has the same question, which is, what's in it for me? What are we getting out of this? If you need protection, good, we need protection. If you don't need protection, then we want something else. And so when you have a world that's divided like this among the great powers, it's an opportunity also for the global South to say, okay, there's a bidding war going on. And clearly there is a bidding war going on.
Now, the last question is the US and the West in decline? And if you talk about, your father's legacy, let's say, if you ask him whether the US and the West is where Athens was in 322 BC, how would you respond to that?
I think I know how he would also respond to it, which is that the answer is no. I think first of all, in my view, since my view is that what the problem the United States is dealing with today is a problem that it has always dealt with, that is dealt with since the founding, that there's nothing new about this problem. So the fact that this problem has emerged does not signal decline, it signals ongoing illness in the American system. And as I said very early on, I still think that the structure of the international system favors the democracies. As long as the United States is still playing the game, is still in the game, I think, for one thing, I think transatlantic relations I can hardly think of a time when they haven't been better. Now, of course, there's a reason for why they're good, but nevertheless, they are good. America's relationship with its Asian allies is very good these days. So, and I think ultimately, if you take that collective power of Europe, East Asia, the United States, that is a greater collective power than China, Russia, especially since China and Russia, despite what everybody may think, are not partners like this. They will never be partners like that. And so they're each fighting their own little battle. My basic view is we are underachieving on if you want to call it the West. The West is underachieving. Now, the West is underachieving in part because we're having internal turmoil, but the latent strength of this system, I think, is still there.
I detect a bit of metaphysical faith in your saying, but thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.